In the material we reviewed last quarter, we encountered a few female composers, a very few, as Emily's presentation last week pointed out. But one of the things I've been most interested in so far this year is the absence or occasional presence of female performers. In the context of the church, papal or diocesan authority could limit women who lived in convents and were nuns their access to music and their opportunities to sing particular repertoires. And that was one of the issues we discussed when we were reviewing the Council of Trent last quarter. And we don't see a lot of mention of female performers, at least in the notated history that we've been covering. So the development of opera provides an excellent backdrop for examining the role of women and the changes that it underwent during this period. And I'm particularly curious about the way a woman's status and societal standing could be affected by her choice to perform and the types of roles that were written for women in this time. And we've talked repeatedly about the difference between court opera and commercial opera, and in this presentation, I'll be talking more about women performing in commercial opera. So we see fewer examples of very famous female opera singers in the 17th century, but one particularly good example is Julie d'Aubigny from France, and she's also known as Mademoiselle du Maupin, and she lived from 1673 to 1707. So she led a kind of scandalous life, sort of the subject of gossip in her own time. She was married at a pretty young age, and she left her husband to travel and sing with an assistant fencing master. Um, when she did eventually become part of the opera, she was a celebrated singer, but she's remembered not only for her particularly beautiful voice, but also for her many affairs with important men. But singing in the opera did not always bring with it scandal. Susanna Maria Cibber, also known as Susanna Maria Arne, who lived from 1714 through 1766, was a British singer. Her brother was the famous composer of the time, Thomas Arne. She performed in the 1730s, and although she did have some scandal of her own, she's best remembered for her acting and singing both in masques and in operas. One thing I thought was particularly interesting about Susanna Maria was that she could not read music. And in Tereskin's book, he discusses that a lot of singers at this time, even virtuoso singers, could not read music, which is sort of interesting when you think about how central they are to the performance of the opera and its function. And another great example is Cecilia Young, also known as Cecilia Arne, because she was married to Thomas Arne, and she was a British singer who had a particularly close association with George Handel and performed much of his work. Regardless of these women's individual talent, they're really best remembered in relationship to the men they were involved with, like Thomas Arne and Handel, which I think says a lot about their association with the opera. And I want to jump ahead a bit to the later part of the 18th century and talk about women for whom specific parts were written. And these include women like Caterina Cavalieri, Nancy Storace, Adriana Ferraresi de Bene, and Luisa Lascimombelli. And they were working mainly in Vienna. There's a really great project that was done in the year 2000 called Divas of Mozart's Day that sort of is a collection of recordings of these operas and arias that were written by composers like Salieri and Mozart for specific women to display their particular virtuosity. And I think that kind of gives a really good display of the importance and like prestige that these particular women had gained, and to have close enough associations with musicians to have parts specifically written for them to sing and premiere. So first, I want to play a brief clip of one written by Salieri for the singer Caterina Cavalieri, and this is from the opera Der Raffenkärer. I'm not going to say that right, I know. So let's give it a listen. Okay, we can move on. The next one that I want to play is from the same album, Divas of Mozart's Day, and this is from Don Giovanni, written by Mozart. And this one was also written for Caterina Cavalieri. And I should note that in both of those recordings that we just listened to, the singer was Patrice Michaels, who is in the music department here at U Chicago. So to sort of wrap things up, the focus of my paper, as I kind of mentioned before, I want to talk about the reception of these women in society, um, and what kind of roles these women were getting, and then how that is similar to their representations in opera. There was a really interesting book that came out in 1979 called Opera, The Undoing of Women by the French philosopher Catherine Clement. And so she sort of examines how in operatic plots women often die, and sort of this idea that they're being not oppressed necessarily, but marginalized in the plots of opera. There's been a lot of criticism of this book since its release um, by musicologists because they note that Clement doesn't necessarily focus on the music of the opera, and instead talks more about the libretto, and that which sort of misses the point that a lot of female singers got the chance, like their roles were represented through their voice, and were not made to be passive and silent sort of objects in the opera. So to examine this, I want to look specifically at operas from the later 18th century written by composers Mozart and Salieri to talk about the roles that they wrote, both how the libretto and the musical parts relate, and examine those representations of women and the reception of the women for whom these roles were written in society at that time. Thank you.